Hello, I thought I'd have a bit of a do-it-yourself afternoon. I got a bookcase to build. A 6-shelf bookcase, I think it is. I think I got somebody else to do it. Hello, welcome back. I decided after last week's video on Red Dwarf and the possibilities or otherwise of these new episodes we've been anticipating turning up anytime soon, that I would do a little bit of it's not exactly a retro TV review because it's not old enough, it's 4 or 5 years old. It's a TV flashback to the most recent Red Dwarf episode, the mini-series feature film The Promised Land that was aired on Day. And I thought, I haven't watched this since it was on. And the thing is, with Red Dwarf, I have always watched Red Dwarf, but I haven't always, or very often, gone back to watch episodes again. And with this having been the most recent iteration of Red Dwarf, I thought, yeah, let's have a look at it. It's a wet, miserable Sunday afternoon in January, and I thought, I'm going to sit down and watch The Promised Land. Really interesting to revisit recent Red Dwarf, because the popular opinion has always been, and I think I've tended to go with that as well, and I think I did in my most recent video, is that the show lost its way a bit on BBC Two in its sixth series, or maybe around its just after its sixth series. It became sci-fi heavy, comedy light, and when the BBC chose not to renew it, we'll come back to that in a moment, after series 8, it drifted into this limbo and eventually came back on Dave as this 3-part mini-series Back to Earth, and then a couple of series afterwards, and The Promised Land, the most recent episode. As was pointed out to me in the comments from the last video I did last week, Dave is actually a channel that's part of the UK TV conglomerate, if you like, of channels owned by the BBC. The BBC own Dave, so in effect the BBC made all the Red Dwarf you've had since series 8. My point is that I was aware of that, but my point is that it wasn't recommissioned as a product or a show for BBC Two, where it was getting big ratings. It sort of drifted into this limbo where a very tiny BBC channel decided it was worth investing in some new episodes. So yeah, I'm fully aware that Dave and everything is all part of the BBC, but it is quite noticeable after series 8, BBC Two weren't interested anymore and the show effectively ended. So I suppose it's semantics, it's pedantry, or whatever you want to call it. But no, it is quite right that Dave is part of the BBC, and by that alone, Red Dwarf is still a BBC show to an extent. But it was interesting to watch The Promised Land, and I think I watched it in its 90-minute incarnation. I think it was shown as a 90-minute film and then split into 3 episodes. I'm not entirely sure. I'm sure somebody will correct me in the comments. And I watched it again this afternoon, and I have to say I really enjoyed it. It was really nice piece of classic Red Dwarf with some sci-fi concepts in it. Some quite interesting sci-fi concepts. And as I said before, I felt that the show, towards the end of its run on BBC Two, certainly on 6, 7, 8, I think that the science fiction ideas were very strong, what they were doing with the ideas. The comedy very often seemed like an afterthought, as if they thought, oh, this is supposed to be comedy. And they put in some quite lame jokes just to sort of bolster the science fiction stories they were telling. And I think that what they've done since it came back on Dave is I think they focus much more on the character comedy side of things with some sci-fi ideas. And I think that was certainly a budgetary thing, I would have thought, because it always seemed to me that they probably didn't have the money to splash out on lavish special effects and big sets. So they had to focus more on character comedy. And in fact, in one of the comments from the last video, somebody said, well, why can't they just go back to how it was when it started? It was cheap, it was low budget, it was a few people on a couple of cheap sets. And that's a valid point. But I do think that you can't really do that these days. I think for something which is science fiction, even if it's science fiction comedy, has to have production value. It has to have a certain element of visuals to it. And I think this is where the show possibly wandered off tack a little bit towards the end, when, I don't know if it was the fact that they had more money or special effects were becoming cheaper, but it became more visual and more creative in terms of the ideas and things, rather than the comedy. And I think that the comedy fell apart a little bit. And the thing about Red Dwarf is that it is a classic British sitcom about people who don't really get on, who are forced to stick together. And underlying all that is the fact that eventually they do quite like each other, but they never say so. They don't really say so. It's like Steptoe and Son and Only Fools and Horses. Lots of these shows about people who were flung together by circumstance and had to look after one another for their own good. But they had a grudging respect for one another, but they very rarely would say so because it wasn't in their nature. They were certain types of characters. And I think that's what we've always had with Red Dwarf, and I think that's what it lost. So going back to the Promised Land, this is a 90-minute special, which is a bit of everything. It's very visual. It's very funny in places. It's quite cringy and corny in places, because Red Dwarf is like that. Some of its comedy is very creaky, very obvious, and it does make you wince a little bit. And it struck me that there's nothing else like this on British television. This isn't a show that would be commissioned today. This exists purely on the nostalgia value, the fact that it clearly is still popular with an audience who are allowed to see it. But it's so unlike any other sitcom on British television. Comedy's in a funny place at the moment. I'm a bit old-fashioned, I'm a traditionalist. I like sitcoms with laughter tracks that are filmed in front of studio audiences, which this purports to be. Comedy these days is very realistic and gritty and grounded. And, I always found the audience laughter thing is, it makes you feel like you're part of the audience. You're laughing with the audience at something that's funny. You don't need to be told when to laugh. People often used to say, I don't need to be told when to laugh. I know when something's funny. That's not the point. I think if you're watching a studio-based sitcom, you're reacting with the people in the studio audience who are enjoying it. And it's quite unusual. It's quite odd to watch Red Dwarf today, and there was suddenly laughter. And I thought, oh yeah, of course, they filmed this in front of an audience. Although I have to say, sometimes it didn't seem like that. Sometimes it did seem like a laughter track. But it was quite nice to be drawn back into that world of filmed in front of a live audience. And it must be very difficult to do, because there's a lot of setups in this. There's a lot of visual stuff. There's different changes of sets, quite impressive sets. It must have been quite a thing to see, watch them record this live, because it must have taken quite a while, because there's just so much going on in it. It's just an editing nightmare, I think, because there are lots of visual little ticks and things, even in the studio-based stuff, that's not to do with special effects itself, not to do with models, CGI. It's things going on in the studio. So quite brave to mount this in front of a studio audience, but I know that this is what they've wanted to do over the last few series. Story itself is classic sort of Red Dwarf, I suppose, in that it's ostensibly about a race of cat creatures who are part of the family of cats born when Lister saved his own cat from being put down way back at the beginning of Red Dwarf. And this society of cats has grown up and developed its own society and civilization, and is now ruled by this dictator-type character called Rodon, played by Ray Fearon. And 3 clerics who are part of this community, they don't believe in worshipping Rodon. They want to believe their actual creator, Cloister, as they call him. And they flee the spaceship of the cat creatures and find themselves eventually connecting up with the Red Dwarf crew. This is where we see some of the obvious sort of comedy, but it's very funny, it's very visual. These are cat creatures. So we see the first scene, we see them walking through giant cat flaps and being distracted by red laser beam type things, which actually plays out later in the episode. And what I liked about the episode particularly is the structure of the script, where it has quite a few Chekhov gun type things throughout it. Characters appear, incidents happen, things happen that have a payoff later down in the script. I don't know how that would have played out watching it as 3 episodes, but certainly watching it as a feature, you got the sense that it was actually very well structured. In terms of the comedy, there were some classic Red Dwarf comedy setups here. I particularly like the sequence early on in the episode where Crichton and Rimmer are in the control room. They've picked up this distress call, and Rimmer doesn't want them to get involved, so he orders Crichton to delete the message. But it keeps going round and round. He deletes it, then he spots it again, and he has to re-delete it. And it's that sort of slapstick, I suppose, sort of verbal slapstick of these two working together to try and delete this message and then get it back, and then delete it and get it back. Some lovely sight gags too, when they realise that they can reboot Holly by using his disc, his power-up disc, which is a massive floppy disk, which Cat and Lister have to put into a slot in the wall of the Red Dwarf. there's lots of little bits like that which make you think, oh, this reminds me of the early days of Red Dwarf. There's not so much of the stuff that we used to get in the first couple of series, which were those long scenes of Rimmer and Lister arguing and sniping at each other. Now that's boiled down to insults, a few insults that they throw back and forth across the episode to one another about hating each other and all these various little comments. The cat gets some amusing bits. There's quite a funny bit where the Starbug parachute has gone missing and he admits that he made a lovely silk suit out of it and some mittens. Just those little funny little bits. And of course, Crichton doing his little quirky movements and quirky little things that he does. The whole thing had lots of bits of classic Dwarf in moments and sequences and a couple of little scenes, and there weren't, as I said, long extended character scenes because it had a plot and it had a narrative to keep going. And I think those bits slotted in very well. When they did stop to have these little bits of business, it all worked very well. And I couldn't help appreciating how well this cast of four work so well together. They've obviously got years of experience and they know their characters inside out. They know the way they behave. They know the way they react. They know the way they speak. And with all that, there was a sense that they've aged a bit. Certainly Craig Charles as Lister, he's still supposed to be a slob, but he isn't a slob. He's a bit older now and he's a bit more switched on. But some things never change. You've still got Rimmer as this arrogant, pompous hologram creature. You've got Cat, the preening fashionista, and Crichton, the bumbling mechanoid who's stumbling around the place. And it's all very amusing and it's all very witty. But there's moments that really struck a chord in other ways as well. I really like the bit in Starbug, the existential crisis that Rimmer has when he realises that, first of all, nobody likes him, and Lister's there trying to blunder his way through explaining somebody who people do like him. Crichton likes you, without ever saying that he likes him, which is quite amusing. And Rimmer realising that he's actually dead and he's got no purpose. He's just a hologram. He has no existence. He's died. He has no independent thought because it's all from the hologram. And these are nice bits which are quite touching and emotional, but without being mawkish. It sort of makes you realise that there's a bit more depth to these characters than you might have expected from previous episodes, which has been more about shouting at each other and falling around. So all in all, I really enjoyed this. It was good fun. The special effects, I will say, were excellent. I seem to remember not being hugely impressed by some of the effects when I saw it when it was on, but now I thought it was very good. There's some really good space scenes with giant spaceships. The Red Dwarf has been resurrected, looking really good. There's a nice scene with this fleet of cat ships, and the camera sort of pans back and they're like a big cat's face. These big sort of giant spaceships and little things around them. That's quite amusing. All the cat stuff is very funny. And the attack when they land on this Mars-type moon planet where Starbug crashes. There's a sort of space battle there where the cat spaceship is following them and firing lasers and things. It's hard I can't work out. I didn't research it to find out, so somebody will let me know how much model work there was here and how much of this was CGI. This is fairly big budget, and this makes me think, yeah, I can sort of understand why they're struggling a bit now, because that was 5 years ago. And an episode now, or whatever they want to do now, is going to look bigger than this. And this looked pretty big. Not a big cast, but the sets looked good. They were big, sturdy sets. There were no wobbling walls. This looked like, machine interiors of spaceships and things. Costumes and things were really good. The props of computer consoles and things. It looked as if money was spent on it. And for a channel like Dave, allied to the BBC or not, they must have spent a lot of money on it. And it showed on screen. And I'm sure they wouldn't want to do New Red Dwarf unless it looked as good as this or better. 5 years have passed and expectations have changed again visually about science fiction and so on. So I think that the audience will expect something a bit bigger for the next Red Dwarf. And I dare say that's where the stumbling block has been. The script demands certain things that maybe the money just won't quite stretch to at the moment. I don't know. But I was very impressed with Promised Land. I really enjoyed it. It did make me laugh several times. It made me cringe a little bit at one or two silly bits. But I love the bits with Holly towards the end of the episode. It's lovely to see Norman Lovett back, looking appreciably older, obviously, behaving in the way that Holly did. firing off this missile to try and blow up the moon so that the starbug can be extracted from the sand that is buried under. And that's that laid back sort of, well, I'm all right sort of way that Hardy always has. Norman Lovett is so deadpan. He's a nice addition to the crew. So all in all, it was good fun, and I really enjoyed it much more than I thought it would. I thought I might find it a bit creaky for some reason. As I say, not the world's biggest Red Dwarf fan. I always watch it, but not a fan as such. I watch it because it's in the genre. I like a comedy. I like a science fiction. What can go wrong? And by and large, I quite like Red Dwarf. But as I said, I did get frustrated at that period when it said bye-bye to the comedy and became sci-fi. This was a nice halfway house. I think the science fiction worked, the comedy worked, and neither one worked against one another. They complemented one another. There was no unbalancing. They both sort of kept the thing going, because when you had something dramatic happening, you were never far away from a funny line or a corny line or an amusing visual gag. So all in all, really good. And having seen this now, I would like to see some more Red Dwarf, really. I want to see at least one more turn, because it's such a good cast. And yes, as I said last week, they are aging, and they're all in their 60s. Robert Llewellyn is 68, the others are 63. Craig Charles is 60. So come on, let's get on with it for another Red Dwarf adventure. I'm all up for it. Smoke me a kipper. I'll be back for breakfast. So anyway, that's my thoughts on The Promised Land. Having watched it again, I'm going to give it a chunky 8 out of 10. 8 out of 10 for Red Dwarf The Promised Land. It's still on the BBC iPlayer. So there we are. That's me on Red Dwarf The Promised Land. If you've watched Red Dwarf The Promised Land recently or at all, why not let me know what you thought of it? Leave a comment down below. Thumbs up would be nice too. Also, like and subscribe to the channel. We're now thundering towards 1,700 viewers, which would be rather nice. It would be ace, to borrow a name from Red Dwarf history. So yeah, please like and subscribe. Stick around, loads more stuff to come. Lots of stuff to come in the next few weeks. There's probably going to be 2 to 3 videos a week coming up in the future, as I've mentioned in the past. So please stick around, because there's loads of stuff to come. Lots of retro stuff, lots of new film reviews, all sorts of stuff. So just join in. It's free. All you have to do is click that subscribe button. Right, I'll see you soon. Thank you very much for watching. And until next time, keep taking the stuff.